Hello and welcome back to Count to 10. Today is the first episode in our mini podcast series, and we're going to be covering a topic from the cardiac physiology section. Our topic today is the ionic basis of automaticity, the normal and abnormal process of cardiac excitation. This is just comparing and contrasting the action potential seen in a cardiac myocyte cell versus that in a pacemaker cell. Now, this topic forms the first part of the electrophysiology section, which can be a daunting topic to look at when you're first covering cardiac physiology. I've purposely chosen a topic which is relatively straightforward, however, introduces some of those key fundamental principles that will help guide you through the rest of cardiac physiology. The MiniPod today and the subsequent MiniPods will be divided into three sections. The first section will be the basic facts and understanding of that topic. The second section will be looking at a past SAQ and going through a model answer. And then finally, the last section will be looking at some of the viva opening stems related to that topic and seeing how those viva stems will connect to different topics. That's the final part of understanding. When you're first starting, it's hard enough to just remember the topic that you learned. But as you get closer, you should be able to draw some links between one topic and another topic quite easily. So we'll discuss how those links could possibly come up in some of the opening viva stems. Now, with that said, I hope you guys enjoy this mini pod. Let's dive straight in.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The first key principle in this topic is definitions. Now, automaticity is just the ability of the heart to generate and initiate its own beat, while rhythmicity is the regularity of a pacemaking activity. These are properties that are intrinsic to the cardiac muscle and are terms that are commonly spoken about. Now, looking at the action potential, there needs to be an ionic basis for an action potential to occur. Now, typically these ions are sodium, potassium, and calcium, and to a lesser extent, chloride. Now, by far the most important ion for generating a resting membrane potential is potassium. And we know this because of two reasons. The first reason is that potassium has a very high permeability across the cell membrane. And the second reason is that the resting membrane potential is closest to the Nernst potential for potassium. Now, Nernst potential is one of those terms that gets thrown around, but essentially all it means is the equilibrium of the chemical and electrostatic forces across a cell membrane. So where those two forces are equal is what the Nernst potential calculates, and that's typically around about minus 90 millivolts for potassium, and most resting membrane potentials are around that. So we can say that the potassium is the biggest driver of our RMP. Now, before we go on and actually compare the action potentials between the pacemaker and the cardiac myocyte cell, we need to understand how electrical activity actually flows through the heart itself. Electrical activity starts off at the SA node. Again, it has the property of having automaticity and rhythmicity. The SA node is a remnant of the sinus venosus, and it's in the groove of the SVC joining the right atrium. It's 8 millimeters long and has two cells, round cells that are likely the pacemaker cells, and spindle cells. The SA node discharges at a rate of 80 to 100 beats per minute, and under normal circumstances, there's some autonomic nervous system activity which helps to decrease our baseline heart rate. The key thing about the SA node is that the electrical activity it generates needs to flow through both the atrias. The impulses that spread through the atria are at a pace of 1 meter per second, and they go to the left atrium by the Bachmann's bundle. There's internodal pathways that are both anterior, middle, and posterior that are important to note and can be sometimes asked in a viva setting. From the SA node, the next pacemaker in our heart is our AV node. Our AV node is 22 millimeters long, and it has the same two cells as the SA node. It's located posteriorly on the right-hand side of the intraatrial septum, and it's surrounded by the coronary sinus and the tricuspid valve. Because of its location, the clinical significance is that the coronary sinus is one of those high-risk areas for atrial arrhythmias to occur, and that's why typically the AV node is affected by atrial arrhythmias. The unique thing about the AV node is that it has 3 distinct regions. Those regions are key because they slow down the conduction speed to the slowest in the heart so that all of the atria has time to fill and then empty into the ventricles. These 3 regions are the AN region, so the atria-nodal region, the nodal region, the N region, and then the nodal His region, the NH region. The AV node is the only gateway for electrical activity in the atria to get down to the ventricles. And in the N region, the nodal region, the conduction speed can be as slow as 0.05 meters per second. And these numbers are important to know because they can come up as MCQs. The other key thing with the AV node is that delay in conduction speed and velocity is what creates the time frame of our normal PR interval. As the electrical activity passes through the AV node, it then goes into the bundle of His, which passes subendocardially down the right side of the intraventricular septum for 1 centimeter and then divides into the left and the right branches. There is only one right branch, but the left branch has an anterior and a posterior division, and that's why you can have a partial or a complete left bundle branch block. Now finally, this electrical activity reaches the Purkinje fibers, and these cells have the fastest conduction velocity between 1 to 4 meters per second. Now at the Purkinje fibers is where you get to see the classic cardiac myocyte action potential. However, the caveat is that some texts say that they do demonstrate some autorhythmicity at 15 to 30 beats per minute, but classically their action potential is what you see of a typical cardiac myocyte cell. So with that background, let's now look at the action potentials. The first action potential we'll look at is the fast response action potential. These are seen in the atrial myocytes, the ventricular myocytes, and the Purkinje fibers. They're called fast because of their characteristic phase 0. So when you first look at this action potential, you have to start at the resting membrane potential. The RMP for a fast response action potential is at minus 90 millivolts. We then have 4 phases of this characteristic action potential. The first phase is phase 0. This is the initial rapid depolarization that occurs when fast voltage-gated sodium channels are open. This occurs when the threshold is reached at minus 65 millivolts, and the fast voltage-gated sodium channels cause sodium to come into the cell, which then neutralizes the electrical charge between the cell. And you get a typical overshoot past 0 to positive 20 millivolts. At this point, the sodium channels become inactivated, and this is called phase 1. Phase 1 is the partial repolarization, which occurs because of 2 reasons. Firstly, the voltage-gated sodium channels have stopped opening, and secondly, there's opening of transiently outward voltage-gated potassium channels. These potassium channels efflux potassium out of the cell, and they actually open or activate halfway through phase 0, but they're not fully functional until phase 1 occurs. Then we move to phase 2, which is the classic plateau phase. This is a unique phase where there is equilibrium between the electrical charge inside and outside the cell. This is caused by a balance between calcium and potassium. During this phase, long-lasting or L-type calcium channels are opening and influxing calcium into the cell. At the same time, there's another potassium channel called the delayed rectifier channel that is opening and effluxing potassium out of the cell. Again, both these potassium and calcium channels actually become active during phase 0, but they just have a more delayed response until they're having peak effect. You might sometimes be asked what is the threshold for long-lasting or L-type calcium channels to be open, and that is minus 30 millivolts. The other unique thing about phase 2 that sometimes is underreported is that when you classically draw it as a plateau, that plateau is most seen in ventricular myocytes. In atrial myocytes, that plateau does not last as long and sometimes doesn't look like a plateau at all. Then we get to phase 3, which is the repolarization phase. During this phase, the L-type calcium channels have closed and the delayed rectifier potassium channels are still open. There's also a third potassium channel that starts to open at this phase, called the inward rectifier. Now don't let the name confuse you, it still is effluxing potassium out, and the opening of multiple potassium channels leads to the action potential slowly returning back to its RMP. Now, clinically, we can use drugs here that block these potassium channels and prolong phase 2. However, the side effect of any of these antiarrhythmic drugs is that prolonging phase 2 leads to prolongation of the QT. The final phase in our fast response action potential is phase 4. This is when the cell returns back to its resting potential or its RMP at minus 90 millivolts. And during this phase, we have to now restore the normal ionic concentration. So there's a lot of potassium that's moved out of the cell. There's a lot of calcium and sodium that's come into the cell. So there's multiple pumps here working all simultaneously. There's the sodium-potassium ATPase, which pumps 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium in. There's the sodium-calcium antiporter, which pumps 3 sodium in for 1 calcium out. There's the calcium ATPase, which is continuously pumping calcium out. And then there's the potassium inward rectifier, which is pumping potassium out. Now the fair question to ask would be, do I need to know all these pumps? And unfortunately the response is yes, you do. Specifically the potassium pumps, when we look at the fast response action potential, examiners love for you to know that there is 3 different types of potassium pumps. There's the transiently outward potassium pump, there's a delayed rectifier, and there's an inward rectifier. And these work in order in phase 1, phase 2/phase 3, and then phase 3/phase 4. The last thing to note with the fast response action potential is its duration. Now the total duration of time is 300 milliseconds. However, an action potential has 2 phases. It has the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. In simple terms, the absolute refractory period is when you can't generate another action potential despite how much stimulus you apply to that cell. And the key thing here is that in cardiac myocytes, their absolute refractory period is approximately 200 milliseconds. So majority of the time that the action potential is occurring, another action potential cannot occur. And that's important because it means that it's impossible to summate contractions or cause tetany in a cardiac muscle. Now let's compare this with a slow response action potential. These action potentials are typically seen in pacemaker cells, such as your SA node, your AV node, and down your bundle of His, and they look characteristically different to your fast response action potential. The first thing you note is that the resting moment potential does not exist in these cells, and this is because these cells display autorhythmicity. They have what's called a wandering baseline, and that baseline starts at minus 65 millivolts. It rises spontaneously to a threshold of minus 40 millivolts via a couple of different mechanisms. Firstly, there is a decrease in the fall of potassium permeability, and then at the same time there is an opening of T-type calcium channels. T-type calcium channels are transient type calcium channels compared to the L-type, which are long-lasting. Here we also have the commonly referred to funny sodium channels. They actually stand for hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide gated channels, or HCN channels. The combination of these 3 factors lead to the action potential reaching its threshold, and then we have our phase 0. Our phase 0, unlike the fast response action potential, has a much more slower and gradual incline, and this is because there's no activation of fast voltage-gated sodium channels. There is no classic overshoot in this phase 0, and the peak is said to reach 0 millivolts. And then, because there's no overshoot, there's no phase 1, and there's also no phase 2. Now, Papano says that phase 2 might occur and it might be brief, but it's typically not identified in a normal drawing of a slow action potential. So the next phase you would draw on this graph is phase 3, which is repolarization, and this is occurring because of potassium effluxing out via delayed rectifier channels. This goes back down past threshold and into our phase 4. Phase 4 is that wandering baseline between minus 65 to minus 40. until the cycle is repeated again. The conduction velocity of a slow response action potential is much more slower than that of a fast response action potential. It's approximately 0.02 to 0.1 meters per second, compared to in a fast action potential, 0.3 to 1 meters per second in the myocardial cells, and like I said, 1 to 4 meters per second in the Purkinje fibers. The other unique thing of the slow response action potential is that its absolute refractory period actually extends much further into phase 3. The reason for this is pretty simple. You just don't want these slow response action potentials to have a second depolarization, which would increase your rate of going into arrhythmias. Now let's look at some past SAQs. This is an examiner favorite question, and it's been asked most recently in 2022 as describe the ionic basis of automaticity in the pacemaker cell of a sinoatrial node, which was a repeat question from 2020, and previously in 2016 they were asked to compare the action potential of an SA node to a ventricular myocyte. These questions are usually generally well answered, however there's always the same common errors. The common errors in the last examiner report were describing the sinoatrial action potential incorrectly, having bad descriptions of the different phases, and then saying that phase 4 was a wandering baseline, which I've done in my explanation, but they wanted for you to say that it was spontaneous and gradual depolarization. You can see how in these questions where they focus on one specific topic, knowing the ins and outs of specific channels and how you draw your graph is key. This is what makes this question very frustrating, because even within Papano, which is the recommended text, the diagrams for slow response action potentials change depending on which page you look at. The initial slow response action potential that Papano draws has a phase 2 in it, but then when you look at his drawing for a sinoatrial node action potential, that doesn't have a phase 2 in it. There's also variability in where the peak of a slow response action potential is. And so my response to all this variability is pick one diagram and stick with it. To start this question, if we were looking at the comparing and contrasting the sinoatrial node action potential versus the ventricular myocyte action potential, I would divide my page into two. I would draw my diagrams for both action potential. In the fast response ventricular myocyte, you would have phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. My numbers for the threshold would be an RMP of minus 90 and a threshold of minus 65, and a peak of phase 1 at positive 20. In contrast, in the slow response action potential, I have a bottom baseline of minus 65. And the reason I choose this is because having similar numbers makes it easier to remember. Then I would have the threshold for my slow response action potential as minus 40, and I would have the peak approximately 0 to positive 10. I would only have phase 4, phase 0, and phase 3, and that's how I would draw my first two diagrams. Now below them, I would then list out each of the phases and what channels are being opened at which threshold and where are the ions influxing and effluxing out of. So the key in a fast response action potential is the voltage gated sodium channels, followed by the transiently outward potassium channels, then the balance between the L-type calcium channels and the delayed rectifier potassium channels, followed by those L-type calcium channels closing and the delayed rectifiers being open, as well as the activation of inward rectifying potassium channels. So there's 3 potassium channels that you need to know of all those equalizing channels, such as your NAK ATPase, your sodium calcium antiporter, your calcium ATPase, and inward rectifying potassium channel. The key caveat that I would put in is that the potassium channels and the L-type calcium channels are activated during phase 0, but they only start working or having an effect on the action potential in their respective phases. With regards to the slow wave action potential, the channels you want to mention are your T-type calcium channels and your HCN or funny current sodium channels in your phase 4, followed by your L-type calcium channels in your phase 0, and then your potassium delayed rectifier channels in your phase 3. It's not as important to know exactly which potassium channel is activated in phase 3 for your slow wave action potential, and even if you look at text, it's hard to find exactly which one is activated. It is important for the fast response action potential, and you must state those. Then you can make the next subheading being the important differences. These differences include your conduction velocity, the difference in your resting membrane potential, the less steep phase 0, the amplitude and the height of your action potential, how your absolute refractory period is longer in your slow wave action potential, and the implications of a long ARP compared to a relative refractory period. And then finally, my last heading would be factors that either increase or decrease the rate of depolarization. Factors that increase the rate of firing would be those things such as your increased sympathetic activity, and this will lead to increased calcium influx. So our phase 0 in our slow response action potential will be much more steeper, as well as our potassium efflux will be less compared to our calcium influx, and so therefore our phase 4 will also be narrower and shorter. Increase in temperature increases the metabolic activity and the rate at which the enzymes and pumps work. So this will also increase the speed of our slow wave action potential. Having a lower potassium concentration means that the gap between our resting membrane potential and our threshold is narrower, and so therefore our heart is said to be more irritable and more likely to discharge. And then the opposite effects, creating decreasing rate of discharge. So an increase in parasympathetic tone will lead to increase in potassium into the cell, causing increased hyperpolarization, which leads to a longer phase 4. A lower temperature decreases the metabolic rate, so decreases the enzyme and pump activity. And then normal physiological changes such as fatty infiltrations with aging lead to a slower conduction speed through the slow response action potentials. While your fast response action potential will be very much affected by antiarrhythmic agents. So class 1 agents that are affecting your voltage-gated sodium channels will impact your degree or steepness of your phase 0. Any drugs that are affecting your calcium or your potassium will have an effect on phase 2 and phase 3. Drugs that cause potassium to be blocked will prolong phase 2, and drugs that cause calcium to be blocked will shorten phase 2. In summary, the key to this question is well-drawn graphs with good identification and labeling of different phases in your slow response and fast response action potential, and remembering which channels are opened where. Now, the final thing we'll look at is some opening viva stems related to this topic. If you look on Mac 95, this topic has been asked as an opening stem every year going back to 2007. Either they ask, where can you find the intrinsic pacemaker cells of the heart? Or they ask, can you draw a cardiac action potential for a slow response fiber, example being a sinus node? Or they ask, can you draw the action potential for a ventricular myocardium? So in my mind, if I'm making a viva about this topic, there are 3 approaches or 3 links you can put to these opening stems. The first one about the intrinsic pacemaker cell is quite simple. They just want you to talk about the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of His, and then plus or minus the Purkinje fibers. The clear link here is correlating the pacemaker cell activity to the ECG, and specifically talking about the PR interval. You can see how knowledge of the AV node and the distinct AV node regions, such as your AN, your N, and your NH, can help communicate why the PR interval is as long as it is and why it needs to be that long to allow the atria to completely fill and then empty. The other link with the PR interval would be talking about what other factors can prolong the PR. And this is another past SAQ. And you could think about this in physiological factors or pharmacological factors. Physiological factors would be those that increase our parasympathetic activity, or changes with aging that lead to fibrous tissue buildup in these regions that slows conduction. And pharmacological factors would be things like beta blockers, which slow down the PR interval, and then adrenergic agonists such as adrenaline, which shorten the PR interval. Other less frequent drugs that they could link up would be drugs like adenosine and the effect this has on the AV node, and then go full circle and relate it back to potassium channels, hyperpolarization of the cell, and the resting membrane potential. Now, looking at the opening questions where you have to draw an action potential, speaking with the current examiner, and I feel like I'm repeating this point multiple times, the specific things they want with these stems is knowledge of the different types of channels. So unfortunately, you just have to rote learn them. And then you can see how this stem would lead clinically to linking up with the use of antiarrhythmic drugs. The classic would be class 1 antiarrhythmics that are voltage-gated sodium channel blockers, and then comparing and contrasting the A, B, C subtypes, and then the effect this has on not only the slope of phase 0, but also the length of phase 2 and 3, and what the implication of that is on the absolute refractory period. The other antiarrhythmics that can be commonly brought up are both amiodarone and digoxin. Particularly digoxin is a nasty one to be brought up because it has effects on both the slow response action potential and the fast response action potential. In the slow response action potential, the way digoxin works is to block the AV node pathway. So it's going to increase the refractory period in the AV node. And then the effects on the fast response action potential are a bit more complex. Because it blocks the sodium-potassium ATPase, there's more sodium inside the cell and more potassium outside the cell. As a result, the RMP is slightly more raised, so therefore phase 4 is slightly higher. When the cell gets activated, the slope of phase 0 is less steep because there's less chemical gradient of the sodium coming into the cell, because there's already more sodium inside the cell due to the inhibition of the sodium-potassium ATPase. There is also increased calcium intracellularly, so phase 2 is less prolonged because there's less calcium outside the cell. And phase 3 is also less prolonged because there's less of a potassium gradient. Overall, the fast response action potential looks like a raised RMP, a less acute rise of phase 0, a shorter phase 2 and a shorter phase 3, returning back to phase 4, which is at a higher level. Now, the last link to any of these opening viva stems is unfortunately the relationship with the Wiggers diagram. You can be asked to correlate timing of the action potential to either timing of the ECG or of systole and diastole. The easiest way to remember is that in a fast response action potential, phase 0 generally correlates with isovolumetric contraction, so the beginning of systole, and then midway through phase 3, where there's repolarization occurring, this correlates with isovolumetric relaxation and the beginning of diastole, which occurs approximately 2/3 of the way through your T wave. So this brings us to the end of our first mini pod, and I think we've had a real deep dive into what initially looked like a very straightforward topic. However, under the surface has a lot more intricacies, and hopefully you can see how it can be linked to many different topics across physiology and pharmacology, particularly antiarrhythmic drugs and relationship back to the ECG. If you have any questions about what we went through today, feel free to email me at anirudh@sweetdreamsanesthesia.com. In 2 weeks' time, I'll be back and we'll finally cover a non-physiology topic, another examiner favorite, which will be looking at the principles of the SATs probe. So until then, good luck with your studying and thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on Count to 10.